The scream pierced the quiet afternoon like a knife, echoing across the sun-scorched plains of Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1875. Margaret O'Hara clawed at the dry earth, her fingers digging into the dirt as rough hands pinned her shoulders to the ground. The three outlaws had ambushed her half a mile from town, dragging her from her horse and into the secluded gully where no one would hear her pleas. "Ain't no use fighting, miss," sneered the largest of the men, his breath hot and putrid against her cheek as he pressed her deeper into the dirt. "Might as well make this easy on yourself." "Please," Margaret gasped, her honey-brown hair falling across her face as she struggled. "I have nothing of value that ain't entirely true," another outlaw laughed, his weathered face twisted in a smile that sent chills down her spine. He was holding her wrists above her head with one hand while the other pawed at the small purse tied to her belt. The third man, thin and wiry with a scar running from his eye to his chin, stood watch at the edge of the gully, rifle in hand. "Hurry it up, boys. We ain't got all day." Margaret summoned every ounce of strength in her 22-year-old body, twisting violently beneath the brute's weight. When his grip loosened for just a moment, she drew in a deep breath and released a scream so piercing and desperate that birds scattered from nearby trees. "Shut her up," hissed the lookout, turning back with wide, panicked eyes. The large man clamped his dirty hand over Margaret's mouth, but she bit down hard, drawing blood. He yelped, drawing back just enough for her to scream again, louder, more desperate. Half a mile away, Nathan Thompson lowered his canteen, water dripping from his chin as he cocked his head to listen. The 30-year-old cowboy had been tracking a stray from the Peterson ranch when the sound reached him. Most men might have mistaken it for an animal or ignored it altogether. But Nathan had heard that sound once before, the desperate cry of someone whose life hung in the balance. In one fluid motion, he sheathed his canteen, grabbed his Winchester rifle from his saddle, and swung onto his dun-colored horse. "Go, Scout," he urged, and the horse bolted forward, hooves pounding against the hard Wyoming earth. Margaret was still fighting when she heard the thundering of approaching hooves. The outlaws heard it too, the lookout raising his rifle toward the sound. "Someone's coming," he warned. "Kill 'em and be done with it," growled the large man, still struggling to subdue Margaret. The lookout took aim at the approaching rider, but before he could squeeze the trigger, a shot rang out and he crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Nathan Thompson charged into the gully atop Scout, his rifle already being reloaded as he rode. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice as hard as iron. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of his worn Stetson, but his eyes blazed with a fury that made even the burliest of the outlaws hesitate. The outlaw at Margaret's wrist scrambled for his gun, but Nathan was faster. Another shot, and the man howled in pain as the bullet grazed his arm. The third and largest attacker released Margaret, drawing his revolver as he rose. Nathan threw himself from his horse, taking cover behind a boulder as bullets ricocheted around him. Margaret crawled away from the fighting, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched in terror and amazement as the stranger exchanged fire with the outlaws. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd been in fights before, each shot calculated, each movement deliberate. When the shooting stopped, two of the outlaws lay wounded but alive, while the third had fled on foot down the gully. Nathan approached cautiously, kicking their weapons away before turning to Margaret. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now as he extended a hand to help her up. Margaret stared at the outstretched hand, then at the man offering it. He was tall, with broad shoulders narrowing to a lean waist. His face was sun-bronzed and weather-beaten, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. but it was his eyes that held her deep blue and filled with concern. I'm all right, she managed, accepting his hand and rising shakily to her feet. They didn't. You got here before. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Name's Nathan Thompson, he said, still holding her hand. I work at the Peterson Ranch about 10 miles north. Margaret O'Hara, she replied, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance, her torn sleeve, dirt-streaked face, and loose hair tumbling past her shoulders. I owe you my life, Mr. Thompson. Nathan shook his head. Any decent man would have done the same. He looked at the wounded outlaws. We need to get these vermin to the sheriff in Silver Creek. As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Nathan's horse Scout trotted over, nuzzling his master's shoulder. Margaret's mare had run off during the attack, and she felt a stab of worry about getting back to town. My horse, she began, but Nathan was already thinking ahead. We can tie these two to my horse and you can ride with me, he suggested, then quickly added, if that's all right with you, Miss O'Hara. Margaret nodded, watching as Nathan efficiently bound the outlaw's hands and secured them to Scout's saddle. The men groaned in pain, but offered no resistance. The fight had gone out of them. Before they set off, Nathan retrieved Margaret's scattered belongings, including a small leather journal that had fallen from her pocket. He handed it to her with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the decisive violence he displayed minutes earlier. Thank you, she whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. It contained her most private thoughts, sketches, and dreams, things she'd shared with no one since arriving in Wyoming 3 months ago. Nathan helped her onto Scout, then mounted behind her. Margaret stiffened slightly at the proximity, but as they began the ride to Silver Creek, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the secure feeling of Nathan's arm around her waist to keep her steady gradually eased her tension. What brings you out here alone, Miss O'Hara? He asked as they rode, the two captive outlaws trudging miserably alongside the horse. Margaret hesitated. Her reason for being in the territory was not something she readily shared, but this man had saved her life. I'm looking for my brother, she finally said. Patrick O'Hara. He came west 2 years ago, and his letters stopped coming 6 months back. Our parents died last winter, and She trailed off, unsure how to explain the desperation that had driven her to travel alone across half the country. I understand, Nathan said simply, and somehow Margaret believed he truly did. Silver Creek's not that big. If your brother was here, folks would know him. He wasn't in Silver Creek, Margaret explained. His last letter came from Deadwood, but I've been tracking his movements. Someone in Cheyenne said he'd headed this way, working cattle drives. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. The Peterson outfit takes on hands for the summer drives. Could be he signed on there. Hope flickered in Margaret's chest. Would you ask around for me? You have my word, Nathan promised. As they approached Silver Creek, the small frontier town came into view, a single dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rooftops, horses hitched outside the general store and saloon. People stopped to stare as Nathan rode in with Margaret and the 2 prisoners. He guided Scout directly to the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Dawson, a barrel-chested man with a silver mustache, came out to meet them. What in tarnation happened here, Thompson? The sheriff demanded, eyeing the wounded outlaws. These men attacked Miss O'Hara out by Eagle Gully, Nathan explained, dismounting and helping Margaret down. There was a third who got away, skinny fella with a scar down his face. Sheriff Dawson's expression darkened. Sounds like the Sawyer gang. Been causing trouble up and down the territory. He turned to his deputy. Lock these 2 up and fetch Doc Miller. As the outlaws were dragged inside, the sheriff turned to Margaret. You all right, miss? Doc should take a look at you too. I'm fine, truly, Margaret insisted, though she knew she looked far from it. Thanks to Mr. Thompson. Sheriff Dawson nodded approvingly at Nathan. Good work, son. These men have prices on their heads. Reward money's yours by rights. Nathan seemed uncomfortable with the praise. Just happened to be in the right place. Well, Miss O'Hara, you'll need to give a statement, the sheriff said. And I'd recommend staying in town tonight. That third Sawyer brother might still be in the area. Margaret's heart sank. I don't have accommodations in town. I was planning to continue on today. She can stay at the Peterson place, Nathan offered. Mrs. Peterson would welcome the company and it's safe there. Sheriff Dawson considered this. That's a fair offer, miss. The Petersons are good folk, and that ranch is about the safest place outside of town. Margaret looked at Nathan, studying his face for any sign of ulterior motives, but found only sincerity. Still, the idea of going to a strange ranch with a man she'd just met, even one who'd saved her life, gave her pause. As if reading her thoughts, Nathan added, Mrs. Peterson is a proper lady from Boston. She runs a tight ship, and there's a room in the main house where female guests stay. You'd be treated with nothing but respect. After giving her statement to the sheriff, Margaret found herself once again on scout with Nathan, this time heading north toward the Peterson ranch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling landscape, painting the grasslands in hues of gold and amber. Tell me about your brother, Nathan said as they rode. Might help me recognize him if I've crossed paths with him. Margaret smiled slightly, grateful for the distraction from her ordeal. Patrick's 24, about your height but leaner. Red hair like our father's, mine takes after our mother. He's got a scar on his chin from falling out of a tree when he was 10, and he plays the fiddle better than anyone I've ever heard. Sounds like a memorable fellow, Nathan remarked. Any idea why his letters stopped? Margaret's smile faded. No, that's what worries me. Patrick wouldn't just stop writing unless. She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. We'll find him, Nathan said with quiet determination that made Margaret want to believe him. The Peterson ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began to set, a sprawling property with a large main house, several outbuildings, and corrals full of horses and cattle. As they approached, a woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the setting sun. Nathan Thompson, who have you brought us? She called, her Boston accent still evident despite years in Wyoming. Mrs. Peterson, Nathan called back. This is Miss Margaret O'Hara. She had some trouble on the road, and I offered your hospitality for the night. Alina Peterson was a striking woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair, pinned immaculately despite the frontier setting. Her shrewd eyes took in Margaret's disheveled state, but her expression remained gracious. You poor dear, she said as Nathan helped Margaret dismount. Come inside at once. We'll get you cleaned up and fed. Margaret found herself ushered into a surprisingly elegant home. Though far from Boston luxury, the Peterson ranch house boasted actual wallpaper, polished furniture, and signs of civilization often absent in frontier dwellings. Nathan, have one of the boys see to your horse, Mrs. Peterson instructed. Then come in for supper. Mr. Peterson will want to hear about this. As promised, Margaret was given a private room with a real bed, a luxury after weeks of travel. Mrs. Peterson provided a clean dress that had belonged to her daughter, who was now married and living in Denver. It might be a bit large on you, Mrs. Peterson said, but it's better than those torn clothes. After washing away the dirt and fear in a basin of warm water, Margaret changed into the borrowed dress. It hung somewhat loosely on her slender frame, but the soft blue calico was clean and whole. She brushed out her long honey-brown hair, wincing as her fingers encountered tangles and bits of dried grass. When she descended to the dining room, she found Nathan already seated with Mr. Peterson, a tall, distinguished man with kind eyes and 3 ranch hands. The men stood as she entered, and Margaret felt a flush of self-consciousness as Nathan's gaze lingered on her. "Miss O'Hara," Mr. Peterson said warmly, "please join us. Nathan has told us of your ordeal. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." "Thank you, sir," Margaret replied, taking the offered seat beside Mrs. Peterson. "Your hospitality is greatly appreciated, but I don't wish to impose. I'm looking for my brother, and I can't afford to delay my search." "Nonsense," Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "No young woman should be traveling alone in this territory, especially not with one of those outlaws still at large. Nathan has offered to help locate your brother, and he's the best tracker in 3 counties." Throughout the meal, Margaret was aware of Nathan's eyes occasionally finding hers across the table. He spoke little, but when the other ranch hands shared stories or jokes, she noticed the respect they showed him. He wasn't the ranch foreman. That position belonged to a grizzled older man named Jenkins, but it was clear the men valued Nathan's opinion. After supper, while Mrs. Peterson instructed the housemaid about preparing Margaret's room, Mr. Peterson invited her to join him and Nathan on the porch. "Nathan tells me your brother might have worked cattle drives," Mr. Peterson said, lighting his pipe. "I keep records of all the men who ride for me. Let me check my books." He disappeared into his study, leaving Margaret and Nathan alone on the porch. The Wyoming night had settled around them, stars blazing in a clear sky, crickets chirping in the tall grass. "Thank you again," Margaret said softly. "Not just for earlier, but for bringing me here. The Petersons are very kind." Nathan leaned against the porch railing, his profile illuminated by the lamp light spilling from the windows. "They're good people. Gave me a chance when not many would." Something in his tone made Margaret curious. "What do you mean?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "I wasn't always on the right side of the law," he finally said. "After the war, I ran with a rough crowd for a while, did things I'm not proud of." Margaret studied him, trying to reconcile this admission with the man who'd risked his life to save her. "What changed?" "Mr. Peterson caught me trying to steal one of his horses 5 years back," Nathan said with a rueful smile. "Instead of shooting me or turning me in, he offered me a job. Said if I was going to be around his horses, I might as well get paid for it." He turned to face her directly. "Some people deserve a second chance, Miss O'Hara. The Petersons taught me that." Before Margaret could respond, Mr. Peterson returned with a leather-bound ledger. "I've gone through the last 2 years of hires," he said, "and I don't recall any O'Hara, but Nathan, check with Jenkins tomorrow. He might remember someone fitting the description who didn't stay long enough to make the books." Margaret tried to hide her disappointment. Each dead end made her brother feel further away, and the weight of her solo journey pressed more heavily on her shoulders. "We'll find him," Nathan said quietly, echoing his earlier promise. The following morning, Margaret woke to the sounds of the ranch coming to life, horses nickering, men calling to one another, the clang of the breakfast bell. Mrs. Peterson had provided a simple but sturdy riding outfit that had belonged to her daughter, and Margaret gratefully changed into the practical clothes. At breakfast, Nathan announced his plan. "Jenkins doesn't remember anyone matching Patrick's description, but he suggested we check with old Sam Wilson at the way station 15 miles east. He sees every traveler passing through and has a mind like a steel trap for faces." "I'll come with you," Margaret said immediately. Mrs. Peterson looked concerned. "Are you certain, dear? After yesterday's ordeal, I've come too far to sit and wait," Margaret insisted, "and Mr. Thompson will be with me." She turned to Nathan. "That is, if you don't mind the company." "Not at all," he replied, and Margaret thought she detected a hint of approval in his expression. They set out after breakfast, Margaret riding a gentle mare named Buttercup borrowed from the Petersons. The day was clear and cool, perfect for traveling, and as they rode side by side, Margaret found herself growing more comfortable in Nathan's presence. "Tell me about yourself," she ventured after they'd ridden in companionable silence for a while. "Where are you from originally?" Nathan adjusted his hat against the sun. "Ohio, farm country, left when I was 16 to fight in the war." "You fought for the Union?" Margaret asked. He nodded. 3 years of it, saw things no boy should see." His voice had taken on a distant quality. "Came west afterward because Ohio felt too small, too settled. Needed open sky and new horizons." "I understand that feeling," Margaret said. "After my parents died, our home in Pennsylvania felt like a tomb. Every room, every object reminded me of what I'd lost." She hadn't spoken of this to anyone, but something about Nathan's straightforward manner made it easier. "When Patrick's letters stopped coming, I sold everything except what would fit in my trunk and bought a ticket west." "That took courage," Nathan remarked, glancing at her with newfound respect. Margaret laughed softly. "Or foolishness. My aunt called me headstrong and reckless." "Sometimes there's not much difference between courage and foolishness," Nathan said. "Depends how things turn out in the end." They reached the way station by mid-morning, a simple structure serving as post office, general store, and stagecoach stop all in one. Sam Wilson proved to be exactly as described, an ancient-looking man with a remarkable memory. "O'Hara," he repeated after Margaret explained her quest. "Red-haired fella with a fiddle," he scratched his wispy beard thoughtfully. "Passed through here about 4 months back. Headed for Malad City, Idaho, he was. Said something about silver prospects." Margaret's heart leapt. "Are you certain?" "Miss, I've been running this station 30 years. I remember every face that comes through my door." Sam looked offended at the suggestion his memory might be faulty. "Malad City," Nathan mused. "That's a good 300 miles northwest of here." "Then that's where I'm going," Margaret said firmly. They purchased supplies from Sam, Margaret insisting on paying with her dwindling funds, and began the ride back to the Peterson ranch. Margaret's mind was racing with plans and calculations. "I'll need to find passage on the next stage heading west," she said, thinking aloud. "Though I don't know how far my money will stretch." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "I could take you," he finally said. Margaret turned to him in surprise. "What?" "To Malad City," he clarified. "I know the way, and traveling with someone is safer than going alone or with strangers." "But your job at the ranch. Mr. Peterson owes me back wages and I've got savings. Been thinking about a change anyway." He looked away, as if embarrassed by his own offer. "Besides, I gave my word I'd help find your brother." Margaret studied him, conflicted. The practical part of her recognized the sense in his offer the journey would indeed be safer with Nathan along. But another part of her, the part that had been raised to be proper and cautious, warned against such an arrangement. "People would talk," she said hesitantly. Nathan's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Miss O'Hara, with all due respect, we're in the Wyoming territory. Out here, folks are more concerned with wolves and weather than with who's traveling with whom." Still, Margaret hesitated. "Why would you do this? You've already saved my life." "You owe me nothing." Nathan reined his horse to a stop, and Margaret did the same. His blue eyes met hers directly, serious now. "Maybe I've got my own ghosts to outrun," he said quietly. "Or maybe I just know what it's like to be searching for something important." He paused. "The choice is yours, Miss O'Hara. I won't be offended if you decline." Margaret considered his words. She'd been making her own decisions since her parents' death, trusting her instincts in a world that constantly told women they couldn't or shouldn't. Those same instincts now told her Nathan Thompson was a good man, despite or perhaps because of his candor about his past. "When could we leave?" she asked. Relief flickered across his features. "3 days. I need to settle things with the Petersons and make preparations." 3 days later, Margaret stood in the Petersons' parlor, saying goodbye to the couple who had shown her such kindness. Mrs. Peterson pressed a package into her hands. "Food for the journey," she said, then lowered her voice. "And Nathan is a good man, despite what he may have told you about his past. He's proven himself 100 times over." Mr. Peterson shook Margaret's hand firmly. "Good luck finding your brother, Miss O'Hara. And don't worry about Nathan. I've given him leave to return to his position here whenever he wishes." Outside, Nathan was loading the last of their supplies onto a pack horse. They would travel with 3 horses scout for Nathan, Buttercup for Margaret, a parting gift from the Petersons despite her protests, and the pack horse carrying their tent, food, and other necessities. As they mounted up and rode away from the ranch, Margaret felt a strange mix of anxiety and exhilaration. The journey ahead would be long and potentially dangerous, but for the first time in months, she had a solid lead on Patrick's whereabouts and an unexpected ally at her side. The first few days of travel established their routine. They rose at dawn, rode until midday, rested during the hottest part of the afternoon, then continued until dusk. Nathan insisted on teaching Margaret how to make and break camp efficiently, how to care for the horses properly, and to her initial alarm how to shoot the small revolver he'd purchased for her in Silver Creek. "I've never fired a gun in my life," she protested, as he placed the weapon in her hands. "Then it's high time you learned," he replied simply. "I hope you'll never need it, but hoping doesn't keep you alive out here." Margaret proved to be a quick study with the revolver, though the kickback startled her the first few times. By the 3rd practice session, she could hit the tin cans Nathan set up with reasonable accuracy. Each night, Nathan would establish their camp, always setting up Margaret's small tent first, while he slept under the stars or, in inclement weather, beneath a simple canvas lean-to. He maintained a respectful distance that Margaret appreciated, though as the days passed, she found herself more comfortable in his presence. Their conversations gradually deepened beyond practical matters. Margaret told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about her father's work as a schoolteacher and her mother's beautiful gardens. Nathan shared stories of his 3 sisters back in Ohio, all married now with children he'd never met. "You write to them?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat beside their campfire, the vast Wyoming sky ablaze with stars above them. Nathan poked at the fire with a stick. "Sometimes, not as often as I should." "Why not?" He was silent for a long moment. "Shame, I suppose. They knew what I became after the war." "The things I did." He looked up at her. "It's easier to be Nathan Thompson, honest cowhand, with people who never knew Nathan Thompson, the thief and drifter." "People can change," Margaret said softly. "You're proof of that." His smile was tinged with sadness. "Maybe. But memories are long, especially in families." On their 6th day of travel, they encountered the first real challenge of their journey. Dark clouds had been building all morning, and by early afternoon, a violent thunderstorm broke over them. They were crossing an exposed stretch of prairie with no shelter in sight when the first massive raindrops began to fall. "We need to find cover," Nathan shouted over the rising wind. "There's a line of trees along that creek bed. We can make it if we hurry." They urged their horses forward as lightning split the sky and thunder rumbled overhead. The animals were nervous, skittish from the storm, and Buttercup nearly threw Margaret when a particularly close lightning strike illuminated the landscape. "Easy, girl," Margaret soothed. leaning forward to stroke the mare's neck despite her own fear. They reached the creek just as the storm unleashed its full fury. Nathan quickly secured the horses beneath the densest part of the tree canopy, then helped Margaret unload the oilcloth tarp from their supplies. Working together in the driving rain, they strung it between 4 trees to create a makeshift shelter. Soaked to the skin, they huddled beneath the tarp as the storm raged around them. Margaret was shivering, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Nathan said, concern evident in his voice. He turned his back, giving her privacy. "I won't look." "Use the dry blankets from the center of the pack. They should still be decent." Margaret hesitated only briefly before practicality won out over modesty. She quickly peeled off her sodden riding outfit and wrapped herself in the wool blankets Nathan had indicated. "I'm decent," she said when she'd finished. Nathan turned back, relief crossing his features when he saw her safely bundled. He retrieved a flask from his saddlebag and offered it to her. "Just a sip. It'll warm you from the inside." The whiskey burned a trail of fire down Margaret's throat, but he was right. Warmth soon began to spread through her limbs. They sat side by side beneath the tarp, listening to the storm. "Thank you," Margaret said after a while. "I'm not sure I would have known what to do if I'd been caught in this alone." Nathan shrugged. "You're more capable than you give yourself credit for. You'd have figured it out." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the trust that had developed over their days of travel. Margaret became suddenly aware of their proximity, of the strong line of Nathan's jaw, and the gentle way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he almost smiled. The moment was broken when a gust of wind threatened to tear away one corner of their shelter. Nathan lunged to secure it, and by the time the tarp was fixed, the strange tension had dissipated. The storm continued through the night, forcing them to make camp there among the trees. Despite the circumstances, Margaret slept surprisingly well, lulled by the steady drumming of rain on the tarp and the reassuring presence of Nathan keeping watch. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world sparkling in the early sunshine. Margaret's clothes were still damp, but Nathan built a small fire to dry them before they resumed their journey. As the days turned into weeks, the landscape gradually changed around them. The rolling grasslands of Wyoming gave way to the more rugged terrain of Idaho Territory. They crossed rivers swollen with late spring runoff, navigated steep mountain passes, and rode through valleys so beautiful they took Margaret's breath away. They encountered other travelers, occasionally freight wagons headed for mining camps, families moving west, lone riders like themselves. From these meetings, they gathered information about the trail ahead and news of the territories. One evening, they camped near an elderly couple traveling east in a well-worn wagon. The woman, Mrs. Hollister, insisted on sharing their dinner, a savory rabbit stew that was a welcome change from their trail rations. "You two make a handsome couple," Mrs. Hollister remarked as they sat around the campfire. "How long have you been married?" Margaret nearly choked on her stew. "Oh, we're not," she began, but Nathan spoke at the same time. "We're traveling companions," he explained smoothly. "Miss O'Hara is searching for her brother." Mrs. Hollister looked embarrassed. "I do beg your pardon, it's just the way you look after each other." She trailed off, but her husband nodded in agreement. "Married 40 years, Mr. Hollister said, and I know that look. Seen it in my own mirror." Later, after bidding the Hollisters good night and retreating to their separate sleeping arrangements, Margaret found herself unable to dismiss the couple's words. Was there something in the way she and Nathan interacted that had given the wrong impression? And why did the mistake make her feel so flustered, She told herself. It was nothing a natural camaraderie that developed between traveling companions. Nothing more. Yet she couldn't deny that Nathan had come to occupy a significant place in her thoughts. His quiet strength, his unwavering reliability, the rare but transformative smile that seemed reserved for her alone, these things had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The next morning, they parted ways with the Hollisters and continued northwest, neither mentioning the couple's assumption. But something had shifted subtly between them, a new awareness that made Margaret self-conscious about small things like handing Nathan his coffee or riding close beside him. 3 days later, they crested a rise and saw a town spread out in the valley below them, wooden buildings clustered along a main street, wispy smoke rising from chimneys, the glint of a small river winding alongside. "Malad City," Nathan said, pointing. "We made it." Margaret's heart quickened. Somewhere in that town, Patrick might be waiting, or at least, someone who knew where he had gone. After weeks of travel, the prospect of answers was both thrilling and terrifying. They rode into town as the afternoon shadows lengthened, drawing curious glances from locals not accustomed to seeing a respectable-looking young woman arriving with a trail-worn cowboy. Nathan led them directly to the town's only hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with a freshly painted sign proclaiming it the Malad Valley Inn. "You should take a room here," he said as they dismounted. "I'll find lodging at the livery or boarding house." Margaret nodded, suddenly uncertain now that their journey was ending. What would happen after she found Patrick? Would Nathan simply return to Wyoming, their paths diverging as quickly as they had converged? The hotel proprietor, a plump woman named Mrs. Danvers, welcomed Margaret warmly. "We don't get many unaccompanied ladies traveling through," she said, eyeing Nathan with suspicion. "Mr. Thompson has been my escort from Wyoming territory," Margaret explained. "I'm searching for my brother, Patrick O'Hara. He was headed here some months ago." Mrs. Danvers' expression changed. "O'Hara, the fiddler." At Margaret's eager nod, she continued, "He stayed here for a few weeks, helped with some repairs in exchange for his room. Pleasant young man." "Do you know where he is now?" Margaret asked, hope surging through her. "He took work at the Silver Star mine about 6 miles north of town," Mrs. Danvers said. "Been there a couple months now, I reckon. Comes into town on paydays." Nathan, who had been quietly tending to the horses, looked up. "When's the next payday?" "Day after tomorrow," Mrs. Danvers replied. "Most of the miners come in for supplies and such." Margaret could hardly contain her excitement. After months of searching, she was just days away from reuniting with her brother. She turned to Nathan, her eyes shining. "We found him," she said softly. He smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "I told you we would." That evening, after Margaret had bathed away the trail dust and changed into her cleanest remaining clothes, she and Nathan had dinner at the small restaurant attached to the hotel. The proprietor raised an eyebrow at Nathan's dusty appearance but seated them nonetheless. "What will you do after you find Patrick?" Nathan asked as they waited for their food. Margaret had been pondering this question herself. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I came west to find him, but I haven't thought much beyond that." She paused, looking down at her hands. "What about you? Will you return to the Peterson ranch?" Nathan seemed to consider his answer carefully. "I could. Mr. Peterson would have me back." He took a sip of water. "But I've been thinking it might be time to put down roots somewhere. Can't be a drifting cowhand forever." Their food arrived: hearty beef stew and fresh bread, luxuries after weeks of trail rations interrupting the conversation. As they ate, Margaret found herself studying Nathan's hands, strong and capable, with calluses that spoke of years of honest work. She had come to rely on those hands, to trust the man behind them in ways she'd never trusted anyone outside her family. "Whatever you decide," she said finally, "I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for your protection but for your companionship. These weeks could have been lonely and frightening, but Instead, he prompted when she trailed off. Margaret met his eyes across the table. "Instead, they've been some of the most meaningful of my life." Something flickered in Nathan's expression, surprise, followed by something warmer. Before he could respond, however, the restaurant door burst open and 3 men stumbled in, laughing loudly. They were clearly miners, covered in dust and grime, boisterous from drink. One of them spotted Margaret and nudged his companions. "Look there, boys. Fresh face in town." Nathan straightened in his chair, his relaxed demeanor instantly replaced by alertness. The miners approached their table, the leader a burly man with a thick beard leaning down uncomfortably close to Margaret. "What's a pretty thing like you doing in a rough place like Malad City?" he asked, his breath sour with whiskey. "Please leave us to our meal," Margaret said firmly, refusing to be intimidated. The miner laughed. "Got spirit, don't she? How about a dance later, darlin'? The saloon's got a new piano player." "The lady's not interested," Nathan said quietly, but with an edge of steel in his voice. The miner turned his bleary eyes to Nathan, seeming to notice him for the first time. "And who might you be?" "Her keeper. Her companion," Nathan replied, standing slowly. Though not as large as the miner, he carried himself with a confidence that made the other man hesitate. For a tense moment, Margaret feared violence would erupt. Then one of the other miners grabbed his friend's arm. "Come on, Jim. Leave him be. Sally's waiting at the saloon, remember?" The bearded miner wavered, then shrugged. "Your loss, miss," he said, tipping his hat mockingly before allowing himself to be led away. Nathan remained standing until the miners had left, then sank back into his chair. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "It wasn't your fault," Margaret assured him. Still, his jaw was tight. "This isn't Boston or Philadelphia. Mining towns can be rough places for a woman alone." "I'm not alone," Margaret said simply. "I have you." She reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of gratitude and something more that she wasn't quite ready to name. The next morning they sought out the Silver Star Mining Company's office in town. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, confirmed that Patrick O'Hara was indeed employed at the mine. "Good worker, that one," he said. "Foreman speaks highly of him. He bunks at the mining camp, but like Mrs. Danvers told you, he'll be in town tomorrow for payday." "Is there any way to get a message to him today?" Margaret asked, eager now that her brother was so close. The clerk shook his head. "No regular messenger service. But if you're at the Golden Eagle Saloon tomorrow around noon, you'll catch him. That's where the miners cash their pay vouchers." Margaret's face fell slightly at the mention of the saloon, not a place a respectable woman would normally enter, but she nodded her understanding. As they left the office, Nathan noticed her expression. "I could go alone," he offered. "Bring him to you at the hotel." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I've come too far to wait now. Besides, it's daylight and I'll have you with me." They spent the day exploring Malad City, a young but growing settlement with a main street lined with the essential businesses of any frontier town. General store, blacksmith, land office, 2 saloons, a small church, and a schoolhouse under construction at the far end of town. "It's not so different from Silver Creek," Nathan observed as they walked. "Same hopes and hardships, just different scenery." "Do you ever think about settling in a place like this?" Margaret asked, watching a group of children playing with hoops in front of the general store. Nathan considered the question. "I might, with the right reason." He glanced at her, then quickly away. "What about you? Could you see yourself living out west permanently? The question stirred something in Margaret. Before leaving Pennsylvania, she had viewed her journey west as a temporary necessity to find Patrick, perhaps convince him to return east with her, then resume some semblance of their former life. But the weeks on the trail had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "I think I could," she said slowly. "There's a freedom here that I never knew back east, room to breathe, to become who you truly are without the weight of others' expectations." Nathan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's why many of us stay despite the hardships." That night, Margaret found sleep elusive. Her mind raced with thoughts of tomorrow's reunion with Patrick, but also with growing uncertainty about what would follow. The journey that had brought her and Nathan together would end, and with it, perhaps, their partnership. The realization that she didn't want to lose Nathan's presence in her life came with startling clarity. Somewhere between Wyoming and Idaho, between danger and safety, between strangers and confidants, her feelings for him had deepened into something she could no longer dismiss as mere gratitude or friendship. Morning arrived with a bright blue sky and the promise of a warm day. Margaret dressed carefully in her best remaining outfit, a navy blue skirt and white shirtwaist that Mrs. Peterson had insisted she take. She pinned her hair neatly, studying her reflection in the small mirror of her hotel room. The woman who looked back at her was not the same one who had left Pennsylvania. Her face was more tanned, her eyes more confident, her bearing more self-assured. Nathan waited for her in the hotel lobby, and his expression when he saw her made her heart skip. He too had made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt and having shaved his trail beard, revealing a strong jawline and the hint of a dimple in his right cheek. "You look," he began, then seemed at a loss for words. "Thank you," Margaret said, understanding what he couldn't quite express. "Shall we go?" They walked together to the Golden Eagle Saloon, arriving just before noon. Despite the early hour, the establishment was already doing steady business, with miners and townsmen gathered around tables playing cards or standing at the long bar. Conversation momentarily halted when Margaret entered on Nathan's arm, but resumed quickly enough. The bartender, a barrel-chested man with enormous mustaches, raised an eyebrow but said nothing as they approached. "We're looking for Patrick O'Hara," Nathan explained. "We heard he comes in on paydays." The bartender nodded toward a back table. "Red-haired fella with the fiddle case." "That's him over there." Margaret followed his gaze and gasped softly. There, engaged in a card game with several other miners, was her brother, thinner than she remembered, his red hair longer but unmistakably Patrick. She moved forward without conscious thought, weaving between tables until she stood just behind him. "Patrick," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned, confusion crossing his features before recognition dawned. "Maggie." He stood so abruptly his chair toppled backward. "Maggie, is it really you?" The next moment she was in his arms, tears flowing freely as Patrick hugged her so tightly she could barely breathe. Around them, the miners whooped and cheered, though most had no idea what they were witnessing. "What are you doing here?" Patrick asked when he finally released her, holding her at arm's length to look at her properly. "How did you even find me?" "Your letters stopped," Margaret explained, wiping away tears. "After Mother and Father died, they're gone." Patrick's face crumpled. "When? How?" Margaret realized with a pang that her brother had no idea of the losses they'd suffered. "The fever last winter. I wrote to tell you, but when I received no reply." She gestured helplessly. "I had to find you, Patrick. You're all the family I have left." Patrick ran a hand through his hair, visibly shaken. "I never got your letters. I moved around so much, and then when I took the mining job." He trailed off, noticing Nathan for the first time. "Who's this?" "Nathan Thompson," Margaret said, turning to include him. "He helped me find you. Without him, She couldn't finish the sentence. Overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment, Patrick extended his hand to Nathan. "Seems I owe you a debt, Mr. Thompson." Nathan shook the offered hand. "No debt. Your sister is a remarkable woman. I was honored to help." The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's heart swell, even as she recognized the note of finality. With Patrick found, Nathan's promise was fulfilled. Their journey together was ending. The three of them moved to a quieter corner of the saloon, where Patrick explained his situation. He'd been working various jobs across the territories, following rumors of opportunities, sending money home when he could. When he'd heard about the silver strike near Malad City, he'd signed on with the Silver Star Mine, intending to save enough to buy a small claim of his own. "The pay is good," he assured Margaret, "and I've got a stake in a promising claim that some of us work on our days off." He looked at her worriedly. "But Maggie, this is no place for you. The mining camp is rough, and even town isn't what you're used to." "I'm not as delicate as you remember," Margaret said with a small smile. "I've changed, Patrick. We both have." They talked for over an hour, filling in the gaps of their separated lives. Patrick was clearly torn between joy at seeing his sister and concern about her future. "You could stay at the hotel for now," he suggested. "There's a decent boarding house for women run by the minister's wife, too. I'll arrange it." "And then what?" Margaret asked. Patrick hesitated. "I don't know yet. Maybe when I've saved enough, we could move to a more established place, Boise, or even San Francisco." As they spoke, Nathan remained mostly silent, contributing only when directly addressed. Margaret was acutely aware of his withdrawal, of the careful distance he was placing between them now that her brother was found. It sent a pang through her that was at odds with the joy of her reunion with Patrick. When they finally left the saloon, Patrick promised to return in the evening after settling matters at the mining camp. He hugged Margaret again, then shook Nathan's hand with genuine gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for bringing my sister safely to me," he said. "Just take good care of her," Nathan replied, his eyes briefly meeting Margaret's before looking away. As Patrick departed, Margaret and Nathan stood in the dusty street, an awkward silence falling between them for perhaps the first time since they'd met. "Well," Nathan finally said, "you found him. Mission accomplished." "Yes," Margaret agreed, though the word felt hollow. "Nathan, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm glad I could help. Patrick seems like a good man." "He is," Margaret said. "But Nathan, what will you do now?" He shrugged, looking down the street rather than at her. "Head back to Wyoming, I suppose. Mr. Peterson will have work for me." "Of course," Margaret said, fighting to keep disappointment from her voice. What had she expected? That he would stay? That he would ask her to come with him? Such thoughts were foolish, born of the unusual intimacy of their journey. "I should check on the horses," Nathan said abruptly. "Make sure they're ready for the trip back." Before Margaret could respond, he was walking away, his shoulders set in a rigid line that spoke of restraint rather than indifference. She watched him go, a hollow feeling expanding in her chest despite the joy of finding Patrick. That evening, Patrick returned as promised, taking Margaret to dinner at the hotel's restaurant. He was full of plans and possibilities now that they were reunited, but Margaret found it hard to focus on his words. Her thoughts kept drifting to Nathan, who had declined to join them, claiming he needed to prepare for his departure the following morning. "Maggie, are you listening?" Patrick asked, noticing her distraction. "I'm sorry," she said, forcing a smile. "It's been an overwhelming day." Patrick studied her face. "It's more than that. What's troubling you?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how to explain feelings she herself was only beginning to understand. "It's just, Nathan has been my constant companion for weeks. The thought of him leaving so suddenly feels strange." Understanding dawned in Patrick's eyes. "You care for him," he stated simply. "I." Margaret began, then stopped, unable to deny it. "Yes, I do." Patrick reached across the table to take her hand. "Then why is he leaving? His promise was to help me find you." "Now that I have, there's no reason for him to stay." She looked down at their joined hands. "We never discussed anything beyond that." "Maybe you should," Patrick suggested. "Before it's too late." Margaret shook her head. "It's not that simple. We come from different worlds. And he's never given any indication that he sees me as anything more than a responsibility." "Hasn't he?" Patrick's eyebrow raised skeptically. "The way he looks at you tells a different story, sister." Margaret's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" "I mean that man didn't cross 300 miles of wilderness just to fulfill a promise to a stranger," Patrick said. "There are easier ways to be noble." As darkness fell over Malad City, Margaret stood on the small balcony outside her hotel room, gazing at the stars that had become so familiar during their journey. The same stars that had watched over her and Nathan as they'd camped in Wyoming valleys, Idaho meadows, and mountain passes in between. A decision crystallized in her mind. She couldn't let him leave without speaking the truth, regardless of the outcome. She owed them both that much. She found Nathan at the livery stable, checking Scout's shoes by lantern light. He looked up at her approach, surprise flickering across his features. "Margaret, I thought you'd be with Patrick." "I was," she said, gathering her courage. "But there was something more important I needed to do." Nathan straightened, setting down the hoof pick he'd been using. "What's that?" "Tell you the truth," Margaret said, stepping closer. "Before you leave tomorrow." He went very still, watching her with an intensity that might have intimidated her once. "What truth is that?" "That I don't want you to go," she said simply. "At least not without knowing how I feel." Nathan's expression remained carefully neutral. "And how is that?" Margaret took another step toward him, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, illuminated by the lantern light. "I love you," she said, the words both frightening and freeing. "I think I have since somewhere between Wyoming and here. I know it might not change anything, you may still choose to leave, but I couldn't let you go without saying it at least once." Nathan's carefully maintained composure cracked, vulnerability showing through. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you don't know what you're saying. I'm not the kind of man a woman like you should love." "Aren't you?" she challenged gently. "A man who risked his life for a stranger, who kept his word at great personal cost, who showed me kindness and respect when many wouldn't have." She shook her head. "If you're not worthy of love, Nathan Thompson, then I don't know who is." He closed his eyes briefly, as if her words caused him physical pain. "You deserve better than a former outlaw with nothing to his name but a horse and saddle." "I deserve the man I choose," Margaret countered, "and I choose you if you'll have me." When Nathan opened his eyes again, the conflict in them was evident. "And what about Patrick? Your plans?" "Patrick wants me to be happy," she said. "As for plans, I've learned that life rarely follows them anyway." She smiled slightly. "I certainly never planned to fall in love with a Wyoming cowboy when I left Pennsylvania." Something shifted in Nathan's expression, hope, breaking through doubt like sunrise through clouds. "I've been fighting this since the day I pulled those outlaws off you," he admitted quietly. "Telling myself it was wrong to feel this way, that once we found your brother, I'd ride away and let you get on with your life." He reached out tentatively, his calloused fingers brushing her cheek. "But God help me, Margaret, I don't think I can." "Then don't," she whispered, leaning into his touch. Nathan's resolve visibly crumbled. He pulled her to him, one arm circling her waist while his other hand cradled her face with surprising gentleness. For a heartbeat, he searched her eyes, giving her one last chance to reconsider. Then his lips found hers in a kiss that expressed everything words could not: tenderness and passion, longing and promise. Margaret responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she surrendered to feelings she'd held in check for too long. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the rapid beating of his heart. "I love you, Margaret O'Hara," Nathan said, his voice steady and sure now. "Have since the moment you insisted on learning to shoot that revolver, I reckon. Just never thought I had the right to say it." She looked up at him, joy bubbling through her. "You have every right, and I want to hear it every day from now on." He smiled, that rare, transformative smile that had become so precious to her. "That can be arranged." They walked hand in hand back to the hotel, where Patrick was waiting in the lobby. One look at their faces told him everything he needed to know. "Well," he said with a grin, "I see you took my advice." Margaret blushed but didn't release Nathan's hand. "Patrick, no need to explain," her brother interrupted, standing to clasp Nathan's shoulder. "I've only known you a day, Thompson, but I'd trust my sister with no one else." His expression grew more serious. "Just promise you'll take care of her." "With my life," Nathan replied solemnly. The next morning, instead of Nathan departing alone for Wyoming, the three of them sat together planning their future. Patrick had no desire to return east. The West had become his home, and his mining prospects were promising. Nathan, it turned out, had been considering homesteading for some time. "There's good land available near here," Patrick informed them. "The valley 20 miles west has fertile soil, water, and enough timber for building. Several families have already settled there." "A ranch of our own," Nathan mused, looking at Margaret. "It wouldn't be easy, especially at first." She squeezed his hand. "Nothing worthwhile ever is." Over the following weeks, their plans took shape. Nathan and Patrick rode out to survey available land while Margaret secured a temporary position teaching at the newly completed schoolhouse. The townspeople, initially curious about the Eastern woman who'd arrived with a cowboy, soon accepted her as one of their own. 2 months after arriving in Malad City, Margaret O'Hara became Margaret Thompson in a simple ceremony at the small church. Patrick played his fiddle as she walked down the aisle to where Nathan waited, looking uncomfortable but proud in a new suit. Their first home was a 2-room cabin on 160 acres of land, nestled in a verdant valley west of town. Nathan worked from dawn to dusk building fences, breaking ground, and acquiring a small herd of cattle, while Margaret transformed the humble cabin into a home. Patrick split his time between his mining claim and helping his new brother-in-law establish the ranch. Life was hard those first years, but filled with a joy Margaret had never known in Pennsylvania. Each challenge they faced: harsh winters, dry summers, illness, and the 1,000 natural setbacks of frontier life they met together, their bond strengthening with every trial overcome. By their 3rd anniversary, the Thompson Ranch had expanded to include a proper barn, a vegetable garden that was the envy of neighboring homesteaders, and a small but growing herd of quality cattle. The cabin had gained 2 additional rooms, one of which became a nursery for their son, James Patrick Thompson, born on a snowy night with only Patrick and a neighboring woman as midwife to help. Standing on the porch one evening, James asleep in her arms and Nathan's arm around her waist, Margaret watched the sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson. Patrick was inside, his fiddle music flowing through the open window as he practiced for the upcoming harvest dance in town. "Any regrets?" Nathan asked softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. Margaret considered the question, thinking of the refined Pennsylvania life she'd left behind the society teas, the proper suitors her parents had approved of, the predictable comfort of established civilization. Then she looked at the strong, good man beside her, the baby in her arms, and the home they'd built together. "Not a single one," she answered truthfully. Nathan's arm tightened around her. "Nor I. Though sometimes I still can't believe how it all began with a scream I nearly didn't hear." Margaret shuddered slightly at the memory of those outlaws, their faces now mercifully faded in her mind. "I'm glad you did." "So am I," he murmured. "So am I." As night fell over their homestead, stars appearing one by one in the vast Idaho sky, Margaret reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. From terror in a Wyoming gully to peace in an Idaho valley. From a desperate search to a joyful finding. From strangers thrown together by chance to a family bound by choice and love. And it had all begun with a scream, a rifle, and a cowboy brave enough to come running. 5 years later, the Thompson Ranch had become one of the most successful in the valley. Nathan's knowledge of horses and cattle, combined with Margaret's careful bookkeeping and Patrick's additional investment from his mining success, had allowed them to expand their operation significantly. Their original cabin was now the core of a proper ranch house, with a large kitchen where Margaret taught their children James, now 5, and Sarah Eleanor, age 3, their letters and numbers when weather prevented them from attending the valley's small schoolhouse. Patrick had built his own home on adjacent land, though he remained a bachelor, claiming that his fiddle was wife enough for him. The truth, which the siblings acknowledged but rarely discussed, was that the war had left deeper scars on Patrick than he'd initially revealed. Some nights, he still woke shouting, fighting battles long ended. But he found peace in his music and joy in his role as uncle to Nathan and Margaret's children. On a warm autumn day in 1883, as Margaret hung laundry on the line while the children chased butterflies in the garden, she spotted a rider approaching. Nathan was in town delivering cattle, and Patrick was working his claim, so she watched cautiously, one hand shading her eyes against the sun. As the rider drew closer, her heart skipped his bearing. The way he sat his horse was unmistakable even at a distance. "James, Sarah," she called, "your father's home early." The children abandoned their butterfly chase and raced toward the approaching rider. Margaret followed at a more dignified pace, though her heart quickened as it always did at the sight of her husband. Nathan dismounted just in time to catch Sarah as she launched herself at him, while James danced excitedly around his legs. "Did you bring us anything, Pa?" James asked, peering at Nathan's saddlebags. Nathan laughed, setting Sarah down to ruffle his son's dark hair so like his own. "Maybe I did at that, but first, let me greet your mother properly." He stepped forward, pulling Margaret into an embrace that, even after all these years, still made her feel as cherished as the first time he'd held her. His kiss, though brief in deference to their audience, held the promise of more to come when they were alone. "You're home early," she said when they parted. "Did everything go all right in town?" "Better than all right," Nathan replied, his eyes alight with excitement. "Remember that Army contract we bid on? For supplying cavalry horses," Margaret nodded. They discussed the opportunity extensively. It would mean a significant expansion of their horse breeding operation, but the guaranteed government income would provide stability for years to come. "We got it," Nathan announced. "Signed the papers this morning. 20 horses a year for the next 5 years. Margaret gasped, then threw her arms around him again. "Nathan, that's wonderful." The children, sensing their parents' excitement though not understanding its cause, began jumping and cheering as well. Nathan scooped up Sarah again while James climbed onto a fence post to be at adult height. "That's not all," Nathan continued once the initial celebration subsided. "Sheriff Miller's retiring at the end of the year. Town council approached me today about taking his place." This news gave Margaret pause. "Sheriff? But that would mean living in town at least part-time, yes," Nathan finished for her. "I told them I'd discuss it with you." That evening, after the children were asleep, Nathan and Margaret sat on their porch swing discussing the sheriff's position. The house was quieter than usual. Patrick had stopped by earlier, but had gone to a barn dance in the neighboring valley, his fiddle case tucked under his arm, and a rare twinkle in his eye that suggested he might have a particular lady in mind to partner. "You'd make a fine sheriff," Margaret said, leaning against Nathan's shoulder as they watched the stars emerge. "You understand both sides of the law better than most." Nathan's arm tightened around her. "Maybe, but I won't take it if you're opposed. We built this ranch together. I wouldn't want to leave you handling it alone." "I wouldn't be alone," Margaret pointed out. "Patrick's here, and James is getting old enough to be truly helpful." She turned to look at him directly. "Besides, the Army contract means we can afford to hire another hand or two." Nathan nodded slowly. "True enough. And Miller said I could start with just 3 days a week in town. The deputy would cover the rest." "We could keep a room at the hotel for those nights," Margaret suggested, practical as always. "Or perhaps look into buying that small house near the school. The children and I could stay there when they have lessons." As they discussed logistics, Margaret marveled at how far they had come from their first meeting. She, a terrified young woman searching for her brother. He, a solitary cowboy with a troubled past. The journey that had brought them together had changed them both, forging a partnership stronger than either could have imagined. "You know," Nathan said reflectively, "if someone had told me 8 years ago that I'd be considering becoming sheriff of Malad City with a successful ranch, a beautiful wife, and 2 amazing children." He shook his head in wonder. "I'd have said they were touched in the head." Margaret laughed softly. "Life takes unexpected turns. I came west looking for Patrick, never imagining I'd find so much more." Nathan turned to face her fully, his expression serious now. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard you that day? If I'd been just a little further away, or if the wind had been blowing differently?" Margaret shuddered at the thought. "Sometimes, but I prefer to be grateful that you did hear me, rather than dwelling on what might have been." He nodded, drawing her closer. "Wise as always, Mrs. Thompson." As they sat together in companionable silence, the future stretching before them bright with possibility, Margaret thought about the young woman she had been, frightened but determined, setting out alone into the unknown wilderness. That journey had led her not just to Patrick but to Nathan, to this home, to the life she now cherished. "I love you," she whispered, the words as true now as the first time she'd spoken them in that livery stable years ago. "And I love you," Nathan replied, his voice deep with emotion. "Now and always." When Patrick returned late that night, whistling a jaunty tune that suggested his evening had gone well, he found them still on the porch, Margaret asleep against Nathan's shoulder, their hands intertwined as they had been since the day a cowboy heard a scream and came running with his rifle, forever changing both their destinies.